Jim, I thought you were going to preach my sermon for me there. Here in a few weeks when we get to chapter 19, it'll all be you, okay? Good morning. How many of you like leftovers? Lots of you. What's that? Depends on what it is. Some leftovers hold up better than others, don't they? But you know, some leftovers are better than the first time. My wife makes some soups, and I don't know how or what it is, but somehow the next day, I mean, it's not bad the first time, but goodness gracious, there's so much flavor the next day. It's amazing. I know in our house, at least, it seems like the leftovers, you remember the story of the widow's jar that, the oil just kept on coming out of it. Sometimes leftovers just seem like that. Like, we're always having, I don't understand how there are so many leftovers. We've been eating leftovers for a week and there's still leftovers in the fridge. We had some friends in college who got married a couple weeks after we did, and she hated leftovers. She would not eat leftovers. And we're like, you're going to be a wife and a mother and you hate leftovers? Like, you better be real good at measuring your ingredients. This morning, what we're going to encounter in our text is that God hates leftovers. Did you know that God hates leftovers? God hates leftovers, and we're going to find out why in just a few minutes. A few weeks ago, we took a 2-week hiatus, rejoicing in Resurrection Sunday, Palm Sunday and Resurrection Sunday. And we're returning now to the history of Israel coming up out of Egypt. And a few weeks ago, Israel left the waters of Elim, having had their thirst satisfied. Actually, the waters of Mara, and then they went to Elim. And their thirst was quenched by Yahweh himself, right? Yahweh made that bitter water sweet. Yahweh had tested the nation of Israel by bringing the nation into a place of need and then providing for them the water. And then Yahweh used that moment, that opportunity, as a teaching moment, a teaching opportunity. He explained that he was going to test Israel. He was going to teach Israel to obey him and obey his law. If Israel would just trust in Yahweh and obey the law of Yahweh, the text says, will not plague Israel, but instead he would be the healer of Israel. You remember those words there in the end of verse number 26 of chapter 15, I am Yahweh, your healer. Well, Israel now moves on from Elim. Notice with me, our text this morning in chapter 16 begins in verses 1 through 3. Exodus chapter 16 and verses 1 through 3. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin. Just by way of parentheses, it's not like sin is in iniquity. This is just the name of a place that in Hebrew it sounds like sin. In English the word is iniquity, but in Hebrew it's not. So no correlation between sin as in iniquity and the name of this wilderness. It's just a big wilderness. It's called this place. Anyway, so they came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month, after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of Yahweh in the land of Egypt, where we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Boy, talk about melodramatic. Locations have changed, but the nature of the difficulty has changed, but the difficulty itself, the test itself, actually remains the same. And unfortunately, the response remains the same. Israel grumbles, right? Israel grumbles. Israel's response to suffering hasn't changed since chapter 15. I'm the father of 3 little girls, and at least 2 of them have learned to be very, very melodramatic. I suspect the third one is a little bit as well, even though she's only a few months old. Things are just so horrible. She doesn't understand irony yet. Israel is certainly making a big deal about this and idealizing her memory of Egypt, right? Whatever plenty, thinking objectively, we understand that whatever plenty that Israel may have enjoyed in the land of Egypt, it was certainly tempered by laborious service, right? This was a case of selective memory for Israel. You've heard of selective memory. Your mom ever accused you of selective memory? It was a plague in our house, apparently. My mom would insist that she had told us this or that or the other thing. For the life of me, I could not remember her saying that. And that was certainly convenient, wasn't it? Israel is quite incredibly forgetting some really important things that God has just done and that God has just said to Israel. Israel had suffered tremendously over the past few months and years, and she's now selectively forgetting that too. Oh, that we were back in Egypt where we had so much food and we were being killed with labor. But we won't mention that part, right? And it's interesting because just as in the case of the water, Israel is now blaming Moses for their problem. They say to Moses, "You have brought us out of the wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." Moses, this is your fault, they say. But graciously, Yahweh intercedes immediately in the situation, and he explains to Moses how he is going to remedy the situation for Israel. Notice with me verses 4 through 8. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not." Does that sound familiar? "On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily." So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, "At evening you shall know that it was Yahweh who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of Yahweh, because he has heard your grumbling against Yahweh. For what are we that you grumble against us?" And Moses said, "When Yahweh gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because Yahweh has heard your grumbling that you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but it is against Yahweh." Okay, so notice first of all the response of Yahweh in this text. The response of Yahweh hasn't changed. You remember what we read in chapter 15 in verses 25 and 26 a couple of weeks ago. Moses cried to Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a log, and he threw it into the water and made the water sweet. There Yahweh made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, "If you will diligently listen to the voice of Yahweh your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you, for I am Yahweh your healer." Yahweh had tested Israel by bringing her into a place of need. And now Yahweh is testing Israel by once again bringing her into a place of need. And the nature of the test is that Yahweh is giving Israel a law, giving Israel a commandment in both of those places, so that Israel can demonstrate that she trusts in Yahweh. And all of this goes back to that passage that we read back in chapter 13. Let me just remind ourselves of what had happened back in chapter 13 and verses 17 and 18. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. In other words, a direct route from Egypt to the promised land is through this land of the Philistines. For God said, "Lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt." But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. And so Israel didn't trust in Yahweh. When Israel left Egypt, she didn't trust in Yahweh. And so Yahweh intends to grow Israel's faith through the desert experiences. And this need for food is one more such test. And so what we're going to see is that Yahweh will provide food. But even in that provision of food, there are a series of tests so that Israel will learn how to trust in Yahweh. The test remains the same. Israel is being tested to trust in Yahweh and obey his law. That remains the same. The standard by which Israel's trust is measured is the standard of the law of God. Will Israel trust Yahweh enough to obey God's law? That's the question. But the circumstances have changed. The test is the same, but the circumstances are changing. Circumstances are different. Now, in chapter 16, Israel must trust Yahweh for food, not just for water. And isn't that like God? I'm sure you, like I, you have identified weaknesses in your character. And perhaps you've identified a besetting sin or sins in your own life. And you're intentionally working on trusting God in such a way that you respond to temptation with obedience to God in those areas. God intends to test you and to mature you out of those weaknesses. And so God intentionally brings circumstances into your life to test you in that area, to see if you will continue to trust him and obey him. And so you go through a testing. Perhaps you pass, perhaps you fail. In either case, you learn. And perhaps you make a mental note or write it on a sticky note. You identify what needs to change in your thinking as you prepare for the next temptation. But then the next test comes, and God seems to flip the script on you. Because it's not the same circumstance. You were ready for that temptation in the same circumstance. You thought you knew how to handle it if just the circumstances were the same. But now the circumstance is different. It's the same temptation, but it takes a different form, a different circumstance, and it comes out of left field. And now are you still ready to obey God and trust in him and obey? And that's the challenge, right? And that's also the point. The test remains the same. The weakness in our character is still there, but the circumstances change, and those circumstances are what hopefully will mature us so that those weaknesses no longer are weaknesses. And that's the case for Israel in the text this morning. She is now facing hunger instead of facing thirst. How will she respond now in this moment of hunger? One author said it was necessary for Israel to learn faith while confused, while afraid, while desperate. Not just in theory, but under the pressure of actual conditions where survival was uncertain and faith was tested to the limit. And she responds just like she did the first time, by not trusting in the name of Yahweh. But God will continue the test. And he says that I am about to rain bread from heaven, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. That's how the test is going to go down. One person explained it this way. He said that the people's willingness to obey the manna-gathering law, or Torah, would show God whether or not they would be inclined to keep his covenant law, or Torah, as revealed at Mount Sinai. It was not just a test to see if they could follow instructions, but a test to see if their hearts were inclined to be his covenant people. Now that is super important to understand, because we sometimes get a misunderstanding about God's expectations in the Old Testament. Sometimes we imagine that Yahweh, when he gave the law, Yahweh simply wanted rigid, even legalistic obedience to his law. But the point of the Mosaic law was never merely external, legalistic law-keeping. As that author just said, it was a test to see if their hearts were inclined to be his covenant people. It was a test of faith. It was a test of the heart. Moses then relates all this information to Israel. And notice the way this is structured, starting in verse number 6. Look with me in the text. Verse number 6, Moses and Aaron said to all the people, at evening you shall know that it was Yahweh who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of Yahweh. Now notice verse number 8. when Yahweh gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because Yahweh has heard your grumbling. So these are four ideas being set up. In the evening, in the evening you shall know that I am Yahweh. In the morning you shall see the glory of Yahweh. In the evening you shall have meat, and in the morning you shall have bread to the full. Those are the four things. And the four things are being set up parallel to one another. In other words, in the evening, God will send meat. God will send quail. And by that meat, by that quail, by that provision, Israel will know that it was Yahweh that brought Israel out of Egypt. And in the morning, Israel will have bread. Israel will have what we call manna. What they called eventually manna. They will have bread, and in the morning they will see the glory of Yahweh. They will see the glory of Yahweh through the provision of the bread. That's the point. Yahweh wasn't finished demonstrating his glory just because he had conquered Egypt. The project of Yahweh, so to speak, throughout this book is to demonstrate his glory, to put his glory on display. He wants not just Egypt, but Israel and all nations to see his glory. The entire book of Exodus was written to show the glory of Yahweh. And so God is going to continue demonstrating his glory as he provides bread for the people. Before we move on to see this glory of Yahweh, there's two other things that I want to observe here in the text. First, Yahweh's provision to Israel was a complete provision. Israel's hungry. And I know a lot of you have experienced a real deep kind of hunger, right? As good as and as sweet as a cookie might be, or as good as a good piece of bread might be, there's something deeply satisfying about eating meat that bread just can't touch. You know what I'm saying? Apparently, Israel was not vegan. Apparently, God wasn't vegan either. Yahweh provides for Israel in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread, and Israel was satisfied. So the provision of Yahweh is a graciously complete provision. It is a completely satisfying provision. Yahweh will make a visual appearance. He will show his glory to Israel in just a moment in the cloud. But he is showing the glory of his grace through a complete provision for the needs of Israel in this moment. And this brings us to the final observation just in this paragraph, and that's Israel's grumbling. This is now the second time that Israel has responded to adverse circumstances through grumbling. It's interesting because in the whole book of Exodus, the word grumbling is mentioned 10 times. 8 of those occurrences are here in this story. 7 of them are in our short paragraph right here. That's not a good thing. We read in verse number 2 that Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And now these other 7 mentions of the grumbling are actually in the context of rebuke for that grumbling spirit, that grumbling language. The point that is being made is that grumbling is not the right response to testing from Yahweh. Though Yahweh did not go on to punish Israel for their grumbling, he does rebuke Israel and make it clear that grumbling is never the right response to suffering. In verses 9 through 12, we have Moses and Aaron preparing Israel for this new event, this new kind of food. Notice with me, Yahweh has promised to show his glory to Israel through this bread and through this meat. But in verses 9 through 12, we actually see that Yahweh reveals his glory in another way. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, 'Come near before Yahweh, for he has heard your grumbling.' And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked towards the wilderness, and behold, the glory of Yahweh appeared in the cloud. And Yahweh said to Moses, 'I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am Yahweh your God.'" So this cloud has been leading Israel since the Red Sea. For about a month now, they've been following this cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And so this appearance of Yahweh in the cloud wasn't merely the cloud. There was something special that happened in the cloud. Something changed in the cloud to reveal the glory of Yahweh. And that's kind of interesting in itself. Apparently Israel has gotten so accustomed to the presence of this cloud that they're sort of just starting to take it for granted. In their minds, they're not seeing anything glorious in the cloud itself. Now God has to do something special in the cloud to make it clear that he is there with them and speaking with them. And so Yahweh does that. And it's interesting because rather than speaking directly to Israel, Yahweh speaks to Moses in front of Israel. And notice with me here in the text the reason for the appearance of Yahweh. Again, the grumbling of Israel is being emphasized throughout this passage. Yahweh heard the grumbling of Israel. We spoke about the significance of this grumbling a few weeks ago. You remember that we said that grumbling is the fruit of something that's going on beforehand in our hearts. You remember we talked about this. Israel's heart is not trusting in Yahweh. And the evidence of that lack of trust in the heart of Israel is grumbling lips. And so Yahweh personally appears to remind Israel that he is there and he is in control. And now notice the logic of the words of Yahweh. He says, I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am Yahweh your God. Yahweh is not providing food to satisfy the grumbling of Israel or to acquiesce to Israel's grumbling. Yahweh is giving Israel food so that Israel may see the glory of Yahweh and know that Yahweh is their God. Israel's problem is a lack of faith, a lack of trust in God. And so Yahweh is providing Israel with gracious evidence that Yahweh is indeed the God of Israel. Now notice that this implies that it is the role of Yahweh as God to provide for his people. God is not lacking in anything, needing Israel to fulfill some lack in him. It is Israel that is lacking, and Yahweh is the infinitely creative provider. He will provide for the needs of his people. He is Yahweh, the God of Israel. The rest of the chapter pretty much is, just until the last couple of verses, is the story, the telling of how Israel went out and gathered this manna. And there's actually two different parts to the rest of this story. You've got, first of all, the weekday gatherings and then the weekend gathering. Both of these parts have, in the story, there's specific instruction, specific law, if I can put it that way. And then there's a specific telling of how Israel obeyed, or in the case of Israel didn't obey, this law, this instruction of Yahweh. This is all part of the test of Yahweh, the test of Yahweh for his people. And one author summarized the two parts of the story in the two tests. He summarized it this way. He said that the nature of the test is in their willingness, Israel's willingness to obey God's instruction, that Israel should not keep any leftovers from one day to the next, and that they should not try to gather on the seventh day. Both commands test their willingness to trust Yahweh for daily provision. So we're going to look at those two parts in order, the weekday gatherings and then the weekend gathering, and see what they teach us about faith. First of all, look with me at the weekday gatherings in verses 13 to 21. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, "It is the bread that Yahweh has given you to eat. This is what Yahweh has commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent." And the people of Israel did so. They gathered some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. And Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over till morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. So the story begins with Israel encountering this strange, fine, flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. They'd been in the desert for a month now. They were getting kind of used to what their environment there in the desert was like. And this was something strange. Yahweh had promised bread, but what is this? So Moses explains that this is the bread that Yahweh is providing for you. And with that explanation comes a law, comes an instruction. Gather as much as you can eat. That's not a hard law, is it? Gather as much as you can eat. That's great. Let's go at it. An omer of bread, just for a point of reference, is about 2 quarts of bread. It's a significant amount, apparently enough to satisfy someone for the course of a day. And so Israel obeys. They go out and they gather what they can eat. But the law continued, didn't it? God's law continued. Let no one leave any of it over till morning. Here's where we meet the rub. See, it's no problem to grab enough bread for today's sustenance. No problem there. But what if nothing shows up tomorrow? Yahweh forbids leftovers precisely because it demonstrates a lack of trust in Yahweh. Israel was to learn to trust Yahweh every day for the sustenance of today. Give us this day our daily bread. You see, that prayer actually makes a whole lot of sense in the context of Israel. It was a prayer of faith in the providence of Yahweh. So how did Israel do with this new test? Did they obey? They did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till morning, and it bred worms and stank. Now, on one level, this really doesn't surprise any of us, does it? Sadly, we don't always obey Yahweh. We don't always trust in the provision of Yahweh. And for the Israelites, there's some pretty gross and embarrassing consequences. Goodness gracious, whose tent stinks this morning? Can you imagine? Everybody knows who left the manna overnight because it stinks. You've been in this position. Here in America, it's kind of nice because we've got 4 seasons, and at least over the winter you have a reprieve from the growing of maggots in waste, right? And at least it's cold enough, and some people leave their houses so cold that all winter long nothing really grows. Over the course of a week, you throw out the leftovers in a little trash can and nothing happens. Well, summer comes along and something happens, doesn't it? Down in Brazil, you couldn't leave stuff more than a day because in 2 days everything is growing. And that's year round. It's just so humid and bugs everywhere, and you've always got to take care of this. Now, there is something of a miracle even in this moment. And we've all had this experience of spoiled leftovers, but usually food doesn't spoil over the course of a night, right? Certainly it doesn't breed maggots overnight and get like that. So this quick rotting was in fact a divine consequence for disobedience. There is something supernatural that is happening, that the food would break down this quickly. And so now Israel is 2 for 2 in terms of her disobedience to Yahweh's law. Actually 3 for 3 if you go back to chapter 15 and her disobedience with her grumbling with the water, right? And Moses is getting pretty upset about this. But there's another part of the command of Yahweh, and it's related to the weekend gathering. Notice with me now verses 22 through 30. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, "This is what Yahweh has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning." So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them. And it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, "Eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to Yahweh. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none." On the 7th day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And Yahweh said to Moses, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, Yahweh has given you the Sabbath." The idea that Yahweh has given you the Sabbath, it's a gift. Yahweh has gifted you the Sabbath. This is a present from God himself. Therefore, on the 6th day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. So this weekend brings a change to the food gathering. On the 6th day of the week, Israel's to gather twice as much food so that they could honor God on the Sabbath. Now, this is all before the giving of the law. Israel doesn't have the 10 Commandments yet. They have not received all of the detailed instruction about the importance of the Sabbath and how they're supposed to guard the Sabbath for Yahweh. This is really the first word that Israel gets about the Sabbath. The significance of the Sabbath they first see revealed to them in this miracle of the manna. And so Israel obeys. They set the food aside for the Sabbath. And notice what happens. It did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Israel is literally experiencing daily and weekly miracles by Yahweh. Yahweh is now preserving this food for an extra day when previously it would breed worms and rot. But and Moses is intentionally making this point, just like there was disobedience on the commands for the weekday gathering, now there's disobedience over the weekend. On the 7th day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. For the 3rd time in this story, a 3rd time in this chapter, Israel has disobeyed. Israel has failed the test of Yahweh. They have shown Yahweh that they do not trust in him. And so Yahweh responds, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments and laws?" And again, remember, this isn't just about a legalistic external obedience. You didn't do what you should have done. It's about a heart issue. You didn't believe what you should have believed. And that lack of belief manifested itself in disobedience. Yahweh has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6 days, he gives you bread on the 6th day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain, each of you, in his place. Let none go out of his place on the 7th day. Though there's no discipline, there is a strong rebuke from Yahweh. Yahweh has graciously provided a day of rest for Israel. A day when they can cease from their labors and come together and rest and worship Yahweh. Israel only needs to trust in the provision of Yahweh for them. What is the glory of Yahweh that is revealed in this story? At the beginning of the story, Israel saw something unusual, something glorious in the pillar of cloud. But Yahweh is in fact demonstrating his glory throughout this story. He wants Israel to know who he is through these events. Who is Yahweh? Yahweh is the God who provides for the needs of his people. He wants his people, Israel, to see him as the God who provides for their needs. And the provision of Yahweh does not have to be known and revealed beforehand. The point that Yahweh is making to Israel throughout this whole story is that even though Israel doesn't know how God is going to provide for her, Israel is still to trust in Yahweh. Israel is to be content with what Yahweh has provided and trust that he will continue to provide for her needs. We like to know the how, don't we? Oftentimes we think that we'll do fine trusting in God as long as we know how he's going to provide. The trouble comes when we don't know how he's going to provide, and we're still supposed to trust in him. And for us, it's not necessarily provision of food for tomorrow. It may be other things. We face other tests, and we're still supposed to trust in this God. And so the challenge we face is to trust in Yahweh even though we have no idea how he is going to provide for us. And you know, it's a blessing when Yahweh provides. When God brings us through a difficulty and he strengthens us every step of the way, that's a blessing. But the trouble is being content with what God has provided, not growing impatient about tomorrow's needs. If God has given you the strength to make it through today, praise him for it. And don't start worrying about tomorrow. Be content with what God has given you for today and let him worry about tomorrow. Isn't that exactly what Jesus taught in the Sermon on the Mount? Matthew chapter 6, words we are very familiar with. Verses 31 to 32. Therefore do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek after all those things. And your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And all these other things, the things that you're worrying about, they'll be added to you. God will take care of them. At the right time, God will provide. He is in control. So when that moment of trial and testing comes, don't try and hold on to today's blessings for tomorrow. God doesn't like leftovers, because leftovers show that you don't trust him for tomorrow. The story ends with a summary description of the manna in verses 31 to 36. Notice with me the conclusion here. Now the house of Israel called its name manna. It was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Now, this is a period in time when honey is pretty much the sweetest substance that they could get. There was all of the techniques that we have today in grinding out sugar from fruit or from plants hadn't quite been developed. And so honey, if you want to say something is as sweet as it could be, it tastes like honey. Moses said, this is what Yahweh has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, so that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness, when I brought you out of the land of Egypt. And Moses said to Aaron, take a jar, put an omer of manna in it, and place it before Yahweh to be kept throughout your generations. As Yahweh commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. The people of Israel ate the manna 40 years, till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. An omer is a 10th part of an ephah. So this is just a footnote, if you will. We don't use an omer or an ephah for our measuring, but in our world it would be about 2 quarts. So Yahweh has continued to provide in this way for Israel throughout her time in the wilderness. Every day, Israel had to trust in the provision of Yahweh for today, not for tomorrow. This test and this pattern of test became an everyday part of life for the Israelites. And the reminder of this test, this small amount of manna, it was kept for Israelites for future generations, so that those future generations would see and be reminded of this miraculous provision of Yahweh for his people. In the testing of Marah, when Yahweh healed the waters for Israel, he showed himself as glorious. He showed himself as glorious as Yahweh, the healer of Israel. Now Yahweh is showing himself glorious as the provider for Israel. But in both of those cases, Israel is being taught that she must obey the law of Yahweh. And again, God's goal is not a legalistic obedience, an external and formal obedience only. A begrudging obedience to the law of Yahweh is no more pleasing to Yahweh than the grumbling doubt that Israel showed. And though we, as the church of Jesus Christ, we're no longer under the Mosaic law, it's not as though we're without law. In fact, Paul makes that precise point in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. You don't need to turn there, but just kind of to put a bug in your ear, so to speak. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 21, "To those outside the law, that is to Gentiles, I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I may win those outside the law." And Paul's point is that even though he and we are not under the Mosaic law the way that Israel was under the Mosaic law, Jesus has still given us his law, his teaching, which we are to live by. And my point is this: God doesn't want a legalistic, a merely external kind of obedience from us to the teachings of Christ, any more than he wanted legalistic and external obedience from Israel to the law of Moses. God's point with Israel and God's point with us is that we grow in our faith towards Yahweh. We obey him because we trust him. We obey him because we are content in his provision for us. God is after our hearts first, and then our actions follow. It's not that actions don't matter. It's not that the outward doesn't matter to God. It does, but what matters first is always the heart. Our right actions, our obedience to God's teaching, follows a content and a believing heart. So as you face tests and challenges day by day, are you tempted to grumble? Remember that Israel's grumbling speech comes from an unbelieving heart. If you trust God, don't grumble about the circumstances and the difficulties that he brings you through. He loves you and he is working for your good. And our grumbling speech does not communicate to God that we believe in him and that we trust him. Do you see this God as the glorious God, your provider? Do you see him as the one who will meet your needs for today? Don't worry about tomorrow. He'll take care of that. Trust him for today. One day at a time. Don't hold on to the leftovers until tomorrow. God hates leftovers. See the glory of God in Christ as he provides for you today. And trust him as your God who provides for you. He is the God who led you out of the slavery to sin, as he led Israel out of slavery in Egypt. And he will provide for you as he provided for Israel. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for this text, this illustration, this parable. Father, we see in Israel's response so often our natural inclination to grumble against the circumstances that you bring into our lives. How easy it is to not trust. We don't see the way, and so we don't trust there is a way. But Father, the beautiful reality in this story is that you have provided, and you will provide. And though we may not know how, we can trust you for today, and we can trust you for tomorrow. Father, I pray that you would help us to hold on firmly to your promises and your provisions for today, that we would trust you for the provision of today. Leave to you the provision for tomorrow as well. Father, I pray that you would show us clearly your glory as we pass through difficulty and suffering. that you would change us to trust you more as we go through the challenging temptations of life. You have tested us. You continue to test us, and you will test us, because our trust in you is more important than our temporary comfort and ease. Help us to trust you more. We praise in the name of our Savior Jesus. Amen.